So today, my presentation is going to be focused on understanding how motivation processes work in children and teens, and specifically how those processes can be influenced by having ADHD. We'll talk a little bit about both what kinds of motivational challenges children and teens with ADHD face, as well as understanding what parents, teachers, and adults can do to help mitigate some of those difficulties. Before we get started, we have to make sure we're on the same page about what we mean by self-motivation. A lot of times when we work with patients as therapists or as doctors, many people say my teen or child with ADHD is not self-motivated. They really need me to be on top of them. They need adults to push them. And that's what it sort of boils down to, is this idea that we are hoping that people with ADHD can increase their self-motivation. But what exactly is self-motivation? What does that mean? So if we have a teen with ADHD and they're having trouble completing their work and getting themselves to get started on things, we often try to look underneath the hood a little bit and understand what's going on. When people are children and they have difficulties in these areas, a lot of times that we think a little bit about them being unfocused or not paying attention. But when we become older and we're, especially when we're becoming teens and young adults, society expects us to initiate these behaviors like homework, academics, chores on our own. And so when we don't self-start and we don't get going with things, we kind of see it as a motivation deficit. So our goals as adults working with a teen with ADHD is often boiled down to the following with respect to motivation. First of all, with respect to academic motivation and education, we want kids to find their own reasons for working hard in school, doing their homework, trying their best. We don't want it to be because, everyone says I should. We don't want it to be because my mom's on my back and it's going to take away my electronics if I don't. We hope that they'll be able to develop positive reasons for wanting to do it on their own. We want students to have goals for themselves and then to work at those goals and to pursue those on their own and to be self-motivated and self-starting. And also we want to do our part as teachers, as parents, to create environments for kids that make them most naturally engaged and motivated in learning. So these are some of our goals that we might be looking at with respect to increasing and enhancing motivation in students with ADHD. Something else that's important to understand is that motivation isn't one thing. It's not that you have it or you don't have it. Just like a car, our motivation has a lot of different systems and parts that go into our eventual actions and what we decide to do or feel like doing. So if we lifted up the hood of the car, we're going to see a lot of different things going on, and they all determine whether the car goes. So with motivation, it's the same sort of thing. If even one piece of this system is broken or isn't working well, then the whole car isn't going to work, right? So it's little things that can all kind of add up and go into whether or not somebody's showing motivation at a given time. And as we'll learn in this seminar, ADHD tends to impact multiple parts of this motivation system. And so kids with ADHD find themselves at a disadvantage with motivation for a number of different reasons. We're going to talk and go through a few different pieces of motivation that are impacted by ADHD today, learn a little bit about why that is and what we can do. We're going to start with intrinsic motivation. So the important thing to understand about intrinsic motivation is the definition is essentially that you are choosing to do an activity because you enjoy the activity, because the properties of the activity, because the characteristics of the activity are something you just naturally like. So we can all think of things, even personally, that fit under this category, things that you just like to do because you're enjoying it. You're not doing it because it'll bring you some goal or some reward in the end. You're just doing it because that's what you would like to do when you have free time. So in general, children experience some degree of intrinsic motivation for learning. When you're being taught really cool things in school and things are really interesting, that's intrinsic motivation that's keeping you engaged. And that's natural for our brains because if you think about even human history, it's important for our ancestors and for us as we're developing as children to be able to learn about our environment so that we can master our environment and be successful. So to some degree, we've been wired to find enjoyment, to experience pleasure in our brain when we're in environments that optimize novel information, which is the stuff we need to learn. And so if the environment is not too boring, which means we already know it, so what's the point in engaging? And not too hard, which means it's too advanced for us to really be able to get anything out of it. There's this sweet spot in the middle that is where we're still learning new things, but it's not so far off from what we already know that we can't grasp it. So that is the place where intrinsic motivation is optimized. And that's important for us to understand. And intrinsic motivation connects really closely to attentional processes, right? Because these are in our brain, our attention is what orients us to different stimuli, to different information. And so we're going to orient more to things that we find rewarding. So this is the first piece of motivation that we'll talk about today. And if we actually think about the science behind this, and many of you guys are familiar with dopamine as one of the neurotransmitters that's implicated in ADHD, but more generally, that is a chemical in your brain that's involved in the experience of enjoyment or pleasure, right? So intrinsic motivation does link to dopamine. And specifically, our levels of dopamine in the brain are correlated with how motivated or how much intrinsic pleasure we're deriving from an activity. So one of the things that we are in a position to do as adults, whether we're a teacher or a parent, is to have some influence over the environment that kids are in that could potentially influence how intrinsically motivating they find that environment and therefore will engage in tasks that they're being asked to do. So this just kind of just boils down to this principle of, if you've got your kids in a place that's not too boring and not too hard, that's exactly where they're going to be best suited to learn. So we have an opportunity to kind of look for those spaces for kids in their life to try to maximally engage them in what they're learning. One important thing for us to keep in mind is that intrinsic motivation is a natural process. So we can't control necessarily what kids naturally find interesting. That's just something that is a characteristic of a kid that we accept about how they are. So in theory, we are kind of trying to pick the environment to fit the kid instead of trying to force the kid into the environment, if that makes sense. So with respect to ADHD, and one more thing I'll say, just because this connects to some pop culture ideas that people may have been exposed to. The idea of the pinnacle of intrinsic motivation, when you find that optimal point where you're just very interested, very engaged, is this idea of the flow state, which is that in the zone feeling that we've all had before when we're doing things that we're skilled at and we enjoy. And that's that full engagement with a sense of energized focus in what you're doing. And of course, we can't always get into the zone, always, get there. But the idea is that this is something that kind of captures ultimately what we're trying to help kids be able to learn about and tap into. And it sort of does represent that optimal point where you can really be engaged in your environment. And it is influenced on your ability and your personal interests. So again, that if we're trying to optimize intrinsic motivation in kids, we can kind of look at this literature, this research on flow, and understand that they are connected. So these are the things we're keeping in mind for building intrinsic motivation. Now, with respect to ADHD, there's research that suggests a few things. First of all, we know that kids with ADHD have lower levels of intrinsic motivation for schoolwork, which means they just don't naturally click with academics as much as many of their classmates would, in terms of how much they enjoy it, right? That intrinsic motivation for learning may be less for kids with ADHD, and there's some reasons for that. One of them is that we know that kids with ADHD, because of their atypical dopamine levels and activity, will not necessarily feel the same intrinsic or endogenous rewards, which means their brain doesn't make as much of that chemical go off per se when there's something potentially rewarding in front of them. And so what that means is that they just may not experience as much internal pleasure from an interesting story or some interesting information as some of their friends may, on average, right? Because there's always going to be those niche topics that kids are interested in that are exceptions to this rule. But just, sitting in class, on average, they may just not feel as much of that rewarding feeling inside of them, which is what keeps them engaged, right? So this is all linked to attention. It's all linked to motivation and how much kids are working in school. So the other piece that's important to think about is it's not just about the chemical going off in your brain right now. Your learning history also influences this level of motivation. So if you have a history of struggling in school, you are going to start to associate schoolwork with, feelings of boredom, feelings of frustration, potentially beliefs about yourself not being able to do that schoolwork. And when those things come to play, that also influences how enjoyable you find it. So all of this, especially as kids get older, can build up over time and make kids less and less motivated to just naturally want to engage in work because it's interesting, right? Some of us may have careers or may remember subjects at school where we just didn't mind doing it at all because it was kind of cool to learn about. And that's something that the deck is a little bit stacked against kids with ADHD for experiencing that in general. So just to wrap up this piece on intrinsic motivation, so what can we do? What are some of the things that we could try to influence here? Okay, well, one point is ask ourselves, does the kid's ability level match the curriculum they're in? Are we hitting that sweet spot where it's challenging enough that it's interesting and new and engaging, but not too challenging that it feels impossible to even be able to keep up, right? So we're looking for that sweet spot in our choices about what curriculum and classrooms and programs academically kids are in. This goes for activities that kids are in as well, not just school. We can also use intrinsic motivation to our advantage because everyone is intrinsically motivated for something, right? So for some people, it may be less common things than for others, but one example of this is that if we find things or we notice things that our kids might seem more interested in, the things that are kind of their unique areas of interest, how can we route them into productive and interesting and skill building activities within those domains so that we can take advantage of them, so that we can say, hey, I've noticed that this kid is really interested in engineering. There aren't a lot of engineering classes at this middle school, but there's this other middle school that has this STEM program, and maybe that's a good fit for them because they'll think what they're learning is kind of cool and they'll work more at it. So those are the things we have to look for kids with ADHD more so than we might for their classmates, because we know that those reward systems are kind of stacking the deck against them on average. So we kind of really have to make more of an effort to put them into curriculum and to put them into areas that they naturally enjoy. The other piece here is when we have to ask kids to do things that they don't enjoy and that they find boring or hard and there's no getting around doing the thing, can we increase choice as much as possible in how those things are done so that kids do have an opportunity to do it in ways that seem the least aversive to them? And what we mean by that is, if there's a project, can they pick the topic that, is somewhat interesting to them? Can we try to get them to do that? If there's household chores that they don't do or don't like to do, are there ways to structure those chores to make the kids, find them less aversive? So, I could go on about this for a long time, but these are some of the main principles of, things that we can keep in mind as we're thinking about how to interact with kids with ADHD. Okay, so back to our kind of main slide here about different parts of motivation systems. We talked about intrinsic motivation. Now we're going to talk about extrinsic motivation. So the idea is with extrinsic motivation, what this means is you're doing a task because you want the thing that the task will lead to. Or in other words, you're doing the task because you want something to happen later because you've done the task, right? So this isn't I'm doing the task because I like it. It's because I know if I do this, I'm going to get something that I want. So I'll go over one more time. So this is usually extrinsic motivation is the motivation system that kicks in when you're doing something that you may not necessarily do just because you like it. You may not like it. It may be something hard. It may be something boring. But we're choosing to do those harder, boring things because it's going to benefit us eventually. And that is what extrinsic motivation is. So here's the picture of the person doing the really like arduous and not so fun workout. And here's the good thing that happens later. She loses some weight and she's happy about that. So that's extrinsic motivation. Okay. So let's think about extrinsic motivation in ADHD. And we know this, we've known this for years working with children with ADHD and people doing behavior management programs with them where they increase rewards, right? So the idea is that if you have ADHD, you may need particularly strong extrinsic motivators to make up for deficits in intrinsic motivation. So you don't just naturally engage in school. We have to figure out, well, if you don't find it super interesting to begin with, can we create some sort of incentive for you where you won't do it for intrinsic reasons, but maybe you'll do it for extrinsic reasons. The double-edged sword here, though, is that not only is intrinsic motivation impaired in students with ADHD due to those reward sensitivity deficits and that learning history, but so is extrinsic motivation for basically the same reasons. So how do we think about extrinsic motivation? Well, it's not just offering incentives, right? Because sometimes we can be extrinsically motivated on our own for our own reasons. So that means I'm doing this because I see some benefit in it for myself, and it's not because I'm being offered a reward. It's because, hey, if I do this homework, I might get an A in this class. That's extrinsic motivation because you don't like the homework, but you want the A, and that's why you're doing it. So from a therapeutic approach, how do we intervene on extrinsic motivation? Well, before we even talk about rewards, let's talk about if we can do this a better way, a self-motivated extrinsic motivation, right? So this starts with goals, and this is usually what we would do in therapy or educational setting, is sit down with the child and ask them, what are your goals? Do you know what they are? Do you know what your priorities are? And we can only make goals for ourselves. And we can only truly, reflect upon our priorities for ourselves. No one can force that on anyone. So this is when kids don't know what their goals are, don't have them yet because they're too young. We can move them towards that by doing things like helping them develop interests, right? Help them develop self-awareness of what they are interested in, what are the things you like more than other things. And that helps kids look forward at goals they might want to set in those areas that they're interested in. Goals can be immediate, as in, let's see if I can accomplish this today. Goals can be short term, as in, I'm really hoping I can get a B in this class. Or goals could be long term, which could be, I'm in 7th grade right now and I see a magnet program I'd like to get into it for a high school, and I want to work towards preparing myself for that. So these are all different kinds of goals. And goals are basically, the reward is achieving something that you care about. And that's essentially what a goal is, right? So, but just sitting down and setting some goals is insufficient, right? You can't just stop there. Especially if someone has ADHD, it's really hard for them to make a consistent effort to continue after those goals. And so one of the first things that we have to do to help kids become better at pursuing their goals is really fill in the lines of those goals, paint the picture of what they are, help people understand what is that going to look like for you. And so there's different ways that we can do this. So using goals when tasks are hard or boring as a way to get yourself to do them anyways is a therapeutic strategy that you see in different ways of working with kids. It's also an educational strategy. it's a cognitive strategy. Essentially, it's developing the ability to say, I don't like this right now, but I know I'm doing it for a reason, and this is why, and I care about that reason. So it helps with decision making, right? It helps for kids to be aware of what their goals are so that they can kind of summon them in those more moments of boredom and say, I do care about this and this is why I'm going to work on it, right? So that's something that is a skill for us to learn how to do that that isn't necessarily easy for people with ADHD. The other piece is developing what we would call willpower, right? So if you have to do something that's really boring, uncomfortable, or difficult, can you get yourself to do it anyways? So it's not only that kids with ADHD have trouble with rewards feeling, I'm sorry, goals feeling as rewarding as for their peers, but also in the moment, can you get yourself to do something you really don't want to do? And if the goal feels important enough, that's when we have the biggest shot at being able to overcome those feelings of not wanting to do something. The other side of this coin is self-control, right? So it's not just about willpower, which is like pushing through, but also about self-control. Can you resist the distractions, the temptations to do more fun things that you like, but won't necessarily meet those goals? So this is the idea of, am I able to put down the cell phone to do my homework? Or this is the idea of, am I able to not go look at YouTube when I'm supposed to be doing something else? So we do have a couple of things that come into the equation here for motivation that are known to be deficits in people with ADHD, that they have difficulty with both willpower and self-control. So students with ADHD, we know from looking at the literature, show deficits in their ability to set goals and to stick to them. And this is a little bit different than some of the motivation deficits we've just been talking about. This is due to executive functioning deficits, which is another area of cognition that is impaired in most people with ADHD. And so it's not because you don't find the goal as rewarding per se, as it is just that it's really hard to get yourself to hold that goal in mind, and it's really hard to get yourself to control your actions enough to pursue that goal. However, there is some interesting research that has been disseminated that gives us some clues here about how goals can help people do their best. So like one finding, for example, that I recently read about was in the New York longitudinal study of ADHD. Having educational goals was a significant predictor of how well kids did after high school. So again, it's just a clue to us that those goals can really be powerful for people with ADHD and helping them overcome these deficits. So back to what we can do. So as parents and teachers, some of the things we can do are exposing kids to experiences that help them develop their own interests and priorities, right? So this is something you do slowly over time, is that you help kids kind of develop their interests and then really understand what the opportunities are within that interest area, and really get to see the exciting, rewarding aspects of succeeding in that area. And then this piece for kids with ADHD that can get lost is the link between working hard and experiencing the rewards of meeting those goals, right? So if you think about it, when people do experience success in life in different areas, we know it's a big part of that is because you have to work really hard. It's not just about being naturally good at something. And so helping kids sort of over time start to see this link and to see that the way you get these rewards is by working hard is essentially kind of one of the key lessons that we hope kids with ADHD can internalize over time. And also creating opportunities for the goals to kind of remain in their head, accessible, exciting, right? So if you have a child who's a tennis player, can you take them to go watch a professional tennis match? Or If you have a kid who is really interested in math or science, can they get to go to work one day with somebody who's got a career in that area and see what that's about. So this is because kids with ADHD have trouble with um, visualizing things that aren't right in front of them. Sometimes we have to bring these goals to them and help them really see these things for themselves to keep them as strong as they need to be to keep them going. If that makes sense. Okay, and also this slide is an important reminder that we do have to remain open to the goals that kids have for themselves, because unfortunately, we don't have complete control over what kids are interested in. So whether the goals that kids want to set for themselves are, I want to be allowed to play my video games more often because I love that, or I want to be able to play on a travel soccer team, or I want to be able to be allowed to go spend time out on the boat with my family, or I want to be allowed to go do things with friends, or I want to make it to college, or maybe even I just want to please grandma. All of these things are extrinsic motivators. They're reasons to work hard and do your tasks. They're things that will be the results that could be rewarding, and we have to accept the things that happen to be rewarding to the kids and then try to use them to our advantage. And that's essentially the idea here. So I mentioned this a second ago, but the other piece of goal pursuit is having the willpower and the self-control to be able to keep yourself working hard when it feels really boring and you just want to stop, right? And when kids have difficulties with these aspects of executive functioning, what we usually see on our side is procrastination, being distracted when you're trying to get work done, avoiding work. And so this is sort of all kind of built into this piece of motivation. Um, so as I mentioned a second ago, difficulties with cognitive control are a central feature of ADHD. So that means that it's not just about motivation, but also keeping yourself on task and keeping yourself in control. We know that students with ADHD have a special difficulty with resisting the urge to engage in passive leisure activities. So that's, vegging out, sitting with your phone, sitting with your tablet, just relaxing, and then getting themselves to move back to something that's important, like homework or like a chore that you've asked them to do. And they also have trouble with sustaining attention on dull or boring tasks. They just can't keep themselves working on that stuff as long as their peers can. So those are like core features of ADHD. So it's important for us to acknowledge and have compassion for the fact that even with the goals in place that students with ADHD might set, I mean, they might be super excited about those goals. Many of the kids I work with in therapy can sit in the therapy room and tell me things that they're really interested in and what they really hope and dream for themselves. But when it comes to that moment, they have a hard time getting themselves to keep pushing through, even with those goals in mind. So we have to be kind of like understanding of the fact that that's part of their brain chemistry that will lead to this experience. So I'm going to go through, some of the key recommendations when we're working with kids who struggle with resisting distractions and overcoming procrastination. And there's no like magic pill that solves this problem, but it's the little things that we do in setting up the environment for these kids and interacting with them that hopefully cumulatively and over time have an effect for the kids. So what helps it be easier to get started and working and to keep yourself started and working? So a structured routine where the expectations are clear and where you kind of do the same basic thing every day makes it seem like less of a decision and more of just kind of what I do. And so that's always a recommendation. Another recommendation is helping kids learn how to break things into small pieces that feel more manageable. So if you have a big project, instead of worrying about the totality of this big project coming up, it's saying, you know what, today all I need to worry about is getting a title chosen. And that doesn't feel so bad. And that makes it easier because it's not so hard, right? In that kind of sweet spot that we talked about, makes it easier to engage because you're reducing the perceived difficulty level of this task. We can also help kids strengthen their goals, like we kind of mentioned, because those goals can become self-statements, which are essentially things that you've learned to say to yourself when you're starting to feel procrastination coming on. It's your best card that you can play about your reason for wanting to keep going anyways, and that you want to be ready to play that card in your mind, right? To have access to it so you can say, but this is why I'm doing it. And it takes practice even for adults to get good at doing that, but it's something that we can help kids work on. There's also evidence in the research literature that some of the Eastern practices can improve cognitive control. I think we see more evidence of this in adults, but people have also been showing it in adolescents. So it's worth mentioning that for some kids, learning things like mindfulness, meditation, and yoga can potentially improve cognitive control, which would help with things like procrastination and willpower. So that's also something that for some people might be worth checking out. Similarly, we have research evidence that exercise is something that can improve cognitive control. So just like with the mindfulness meditation, that's another area that could be promising for kids in terms of just something that you can do to help them be able to learn to focus better. Also, our interactions with kids are really important in sort of sending them messages. So when we see kids trying hard, we want to affirm those efforts and we want to affirm those successes and not necessarily only be affirming outcomes, right? So it's not just, oh, great, you got an A, but hey, you know what? Even though you got a C, I saw you working so hard on that project and I'm proud of the effort that you put into that. And that's the effort that we care about, not the grade, right? When kids can see themselves being successful, sometimes we need to take a moment and kind of process that. Where did that success come from? What led to that success? And what we know is that it's often correlated with hard work. So when we do see them working hard, to link that to success and to help kids slowly over time start to see that connection between, you know what, my hard work is worth it because it pays off. And that's something that you can't tell someone. Someone's got to see that with their own eyes. And all we can do is help them, increase their awareness of when that's happening, of noticing that. And that we can do over time. And then, finally, and I'm going to talk about this more in a second, from an environmental modification or behavioral perspective, another thing that can be done is to set up the structure of the home environment so that all the fun things that kids like to do, those passive leisure activities, are contingent upon getting your work done. So this is just the basic rule that there's no TV until after homework, right? It's that idea. So setting up the environment ahead of time so that kids kind of understand that A, those distractions are minimized, and B, I don't get to do the things I like until I've essentially done my part first and done the hard work. Okay. So it's also going to be important for us to talk a little bit about factors that can interfere with self-motivation. So even if you're doing a lot of the things already that have been listed in this presentation, there can be things that kind of come in from the side and can still undermine things, even when we're trying to do everything right. I think a really important one for people with ADHD is what we call in the social psychology literature of self-efficacy. And this is the belief that you could be successful, that you're capable of achieving a certain goal. And we know that many people and students will not work hard towards a goal if they don't think their hard work is going to pay off. If you don't think there's any possible way that you can get a passing grade on a test, what is the point of studying? Right? And that's fair. That in a way, that's fair. If you really don't believe that, why would you work hard? So we have to keep an eye on self-efficacy in kids. We know from research that kids' self-efficacy for how capable they are as students is very strongly correlated with how hard that they'll work on their schoolwork and how successful they eventually will be. There has been research on self-efficacy in ADHD. So first of all, students with ADHD have lower self-efficacy than students without ADHD. And this isn't surprising because our understanding of how self-efficacy is influenced is that if you do receive consistent negative feedback from teachers, parents, and peers, and even you're just objectively looking at what kind of grades you get, you're going to develop beliefs about yourself based on that feedback. And if you're hearing all the time, you're not working hard enough, you're not good enough, you're a bad student, you're not someone that people want to be friends with, you start to believe those things. And those beliefs are exactly what leads people to decide that there's no point because I'm not successful anyways. In terms of other research findings, there's a study that shows that self-efficacy in students with ADHD is related to how much of their homework they'll do. So this is something we have to keep an eye on. So what do we do as adults working with a kid with ADHD to try to help build their self-efficacy and prevent it from getting reduced? So there are little things that we can do that are that have an influence. That's the good news. First one, to avoid shaming or blaming students when they struggle, right? We don't want them to internalize that struggle as something that's deficient in themselves, permanently deficient in themselves. We also want to make sure for kids that we're setting expectations that kids have a chance of meeting. Because if you're constantly being asked to do things that you just you're not there yet, you're not at a point where you can meet those standards, that's where the beliefs about the self being negative can really start to form. So we want to make sure that kids are in academic environments that are setting fair expectations for their abilities, and we want to make sure at home too that we're setting expectations that are fair based on what kids are currently capable of. We want to set expectations that kids are doing just a little bit better than they're doing now to slowly help kids take steps one at a time. We want to also be sending, like I mentioned a second ago, positive messages to students about their effort rather than their achievement. So that means that we want to really give positive feedback and notice when kids are working and trying hard, and not focusing so much about the outcome of that effort, but rather the fact that they are choosing to put in that effort. So we also have to be careful because when we're getting frustrated with kids and they're not meeting our expectations for them, or that we feel like they're not trying hard, our first impulse is often to criticize and to kind of tell them what they need to do better. And from a behavioral perspective, the more strategic thing to do to build kids up and build their self-efficacy and also to improve their behavior is, instead of noticing all the things they're doing wrong, is to wait for the things that they're doing right to come along. And when they do, you jump on those and affirm them and tell them how you notice, so that they start to hear positive messages and also feel like there's one of the benefits of trying is that people actually notice you. So that's pretty cool. So another issue is when kids are successful, even if we still have a whole list of things that we feel like they're not doing well enough at, or that we're feeling like they still need to work on, that we celebrate those successes and not just jump on and say, oh great, check that problem off the list, what's the next problem, right? To actually help kids feel accomplished for mastering a certain problem that they've been dealing with and getting better at it, so that it's noticed that they've gotten better and they get that feedback. Another important message to send to kids is that it's okay to be good at some things and not good at other things, because no one is good at everything. And it really is hard for kids when society is asking them to do the things that they're not that good at. It's just the luck of the draw. Some of us are good at the things that society is asking us to do and bad at other things that no one cares about. So, we want kids to make sure that just because you're struggling at something doesn't reflect your overall worth. Because we're all worth something, but if you really struggle with something and you constantly get negative feedback about it, you're going to start to believe that you're not worth as much as other people. And then we mentioned this before, but another benefit of helping kids find the things that they're good at and to forge some skills in that area and get some time to spend in that area is that they do also feel that they are worthwhile, because they'll be able to point at that and say, hey, I'm good at that. That's something that I can be successful at. I'm a person who is capable at being successful. And so that's part of the building self-efficacy. Okay. Another important piece to talk about is how interactions with adults can also interfere with kids' motivation. So the model that I have up on this slide is based on some research that my team has done. And we've worked mostly with parents, but the same model would apply to a teacher in a classroom as well. If you have a student that's struggling, there tend to be two types of categories that many parents sort of find themselves in, and you could go between the two of them, and you could sometimes find yourself in the middle, but in general, there's sort of two different reactions to this student that can happen. On the left, the first one is adults who have tried for a long time to try to help the student and they haven't been successful at helping the student. And after a while, they just sort of give up and say, what is the point of all this hard work and all of this staying on top of this kid and all of this, attention I'm giving if it doesn't do anything anyway? And when this cycle can happen, parents can become disengaged from the kid, their work, or even just interacting with them. They kind of just develop this belief that kids should just have to figure this out on their own because it's pointless for me to work with the student anyways. And so if parents start giving up on helping, or even in some cases, it's so stressful to deal with helping because maybe you get pushback from the kid or a lot of arguments or, a lot of tears, whatever it is, that parents in this pattern could also just be avoiding dealing with helping the child. One of the main things that can happen is that the kids end up with not having any accountability for their efforts, right? So homework's the most easy example to point to. In this case, maybe some parents just stop asking if the kid even has homework, stops checking to see if any homework was done because they kind of just feel disconnected from this whole thing. And then the child learns, hey, you know what? I don't need to do homework because no one's going to give me any flack about it if I don't do it. So I can just not do it and no one's going to care. And that's when kids can kind of spiral further into an unmotivated, unacademically engaged situation. On the other hand, the other pattern that can happen is that parents start to learn, if I don't give a lot of help to my child, he's not going to be able to handle what school's asking of him. I need to remind him all the time. I need to stay on top of him. I need to email the teacher. I need to sit down with him while he's doing his homework. And a lot of these habits develop when kids are young to try to get them to stay on task and do their homework. And then sooner than you realize, 6 or 7 years have gone by and we're in middle school, and parents are still offering this level of support even though it's become clearly developmentally inappropriate at that time. It's stressful to give that level of support. It takes away from people's personal time and ability to even take care of themselves sometimes. And so what can happen in these situations is that the student starts to learn that I don't need to initiate things myself. Eventually my parents are going to come over and they're going to help me get going, and they're going to, I don't have any reason to have to get on top of myself for this because other people kind of drive the train for me. Now, first of all, these two patterns are completely natural for parents. And I will say that in the sample of families that we worked with in the last however many years it's been, about 80% of parents will say that at some point they've fallen into one of these categories, right? So it doesn't mean anyone's a bad parent. This is kind of the natural cycle of families with kids with ADHD. So, but the question is, what do we do? Because you do get kind of stuck, right? And especially if you know that if I stop helping all of a sudden right now, things might crash and burn, and what do I do about that? So that's hard. So this is just other slides that basically summarize what I just said. The disconnected profile, some of the things that might be associated with that are parents and teachers who maybe stop paying attention if kids are doing their work, don't hold them accountable for it, don't put a structure into place that kids benefit from. And what can happen over time is that when you decide, hey, you know what, I do want to put some limits on them after all, it can get really hard because kids have gotten used to not having limits and doing whatever they feel like. And it makes it really hard then to come in and say, okay, you know what, I'm taking back, I'm reclaiming this, and now there's going to be some rules in place. Another piece of this is, I think we mentioned this, but students can lose motivation to succeed if they just get further and further away from that point at which they have been successful, right? As they get older, as it's been longer and longer since anyone's acknowledged that success, you just start to kind of drift away and feel less and less like trying. So this is kind of the profile here. The other one, we affectionately call it personal assistant in our clinic program, because that's what a lot of parents will tell us. They kind of feel like they become the assistant of the child, and I feel like that's a really good characterization. So what can happen is that the kids lack accountability to complete their work independently. So someone's on top of them, the work's getting done, but no one's expecting them to do it themselves. And so they miss out on those opportunities to have to practice having willpower and to have to practice, getting yourself to do something. Um, in some cases, parents will say that the reason that this is happening is because it feels easier um, to like help them through the work, right, than to just require them to do it on their own. And like we said, it can get worse over time, and this can prevent self-motivation because kids are looking to parents and teachers for cues to get started, and that's sort of what can happen. So I mentioned that. Okay, so there are some things we can do about this. Good news, but it isn't something that can be solved overnight. A lot of what the work we do clinically is working with parents on kind of retraining their whole family to get back onto a good track with some of these patterns that can unfold. So the first couple of things to think about is part of the problem that my kid is not in a good educational setting. Is there a mismatch between what they're able to do right now and where the expectations of this environment they're in? So if you think about this can really happen in middle and high school students a lot, where they keep getting routed into like regular ed or honors classes because it looks like they're doing decently in school because of all the support they've got from parents or tutors or whomever. And then it gets to this point where it's just become really clear that they're being asked to do a lot, and that they're secretly not able to do any of that on their own. And so that becomes tricky for people to work through, but that's kind of the journey, is figuring out what's the best place for my child at this time. Another piece is setting expectations, not only for the product of the work that gets done, but how independent you are at achieving that work, right? So, and this isn't necessarily like pulling the rug out from underneath someone, but saying, I expect that, you are going to do this homework assignment by yourself. Let me know when you're done, and I'll be happy to go over it with you, versus sitting there and doing it problem by problem, right? So that's sort of the transition. Considering what's going on in the environment around the kid, have we removed the things that make it easy to get off task and take breaks, right? Are the electronics put away? Are there loud people in the home that create distractions? Like, what, from within the context of the home we're in, what can we do to reduce that as much as possible? Am I, as a parent, paying attention? Even if I can't be home during homework time, do I have a way of monitoring whether the kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing? Whether the homework's getting done? Whether they're on task? Or what's my best case scenario here? How can I do that? What can I find out? And how do I keep an eye on that? When expectations are met, am I noticing and telling them, hey, like, you did it? Like, really affirming the successes. And then again, this idea of, do I have a good setup at home where there are some rules about those passive leisure things and what needs to happen before kids are allowed to move on to that part of their evening, right? Am I asking for proof of completed work, or am I just saying, did you do your homework? Those are the types of things. And again, the idea is to slowly reduce reminders and prompts to the student, and instead let those consequences, for example, not being allowed to do fun hanging out stuff because you haven't done your homework, drive the change in the kids' behavior over time. So that's some of the things that happen when you're working with families to retrain a little bit. Okay, a few more things I'm going to go over. First of all, what do you do when your student has unrealistic or unhealthy goals? My favorite one of recently is, oh, I don't need to finish high school because I'm going to make tons of money being a YouTube personality or a video game reviewer on YouTube. So that's a good example. And kids are really convinced that this is possible because they're on YouTube a lot watching people who do this. And just like we said with the goal setting, if you surround yourself by this and color in the lines of, with these images, you're really going to believe it's possible and get excited about them. So here they've done that in a way that actually could be risky because not many people get to be a YouTube personality, right? And that's the part that you don't always realize. So what do we do? Well, one of the things we've already mentioned is that you can't control what kids are interested in. And the worst thing, or I shouldn't say the worst, but the least effective thing is to try to use logic to persuade them that they're wrong, because that doesn't usually get you anywhere. And then on top of that, it can make them less receptive to your advice or wanting to talk to you because they think you don't understand. On the other hand, what you can do is look for small opportunities to increase competing things, alternatives that are more positive, more healthy, and more maybe more realistic, and to make those things continue to seem more and more appealing instead of trying to diminish the unrealistic thing, right? So trying to help them see the benefits of the realistic thing. If you see anything that's like positive that they're possibly interested in, to really spend time trying to like build that up and get them into that. And then again, that link, right? The link between working hard at positive things and potentially meeting your personal goals. So when you see opportunities to say, hey, you may not want to do well in school because you care about your grades, but if you, get really good at writing or you get really good at speech, you're going to be just a more articulate, person on the YouTube channel. Those are the types of links that potentially people could try to draw as well. I'm not saying it'll always work, but it's a possible strategy. Okay, a big question people often ask is it good or bad to use external rewards when kids lack motivation? So this is always people want to know. So this is kind of a complicated question to answer. I'm going to give you the information and let people draw their own conclusions. First thing is that hopefully you've kind of, as you've been reading or listening to this, you're starting to see that building self-motivation in kids isn't just something you do in the course of a few therapy sessions or a good conversation. It's a slow process. It happens and it develops over time, over years. If you put the right conditions in place, you're not necessarily going to see the payoff now, but in 10 years, you probably will. And you got to keep kind of doing the right things even if you aren't seeing the results right away. Now, pros and cons of external rewards. First of all, there is a camp out there that's done some research that suggests that too many external rewards can undermine the development of self-motivation. The idea being that kids will work for these rewards other than their own personal reasons to do things. Sometimes people will say kids can become obsessed with the reward and not even be thinking about the value of that hard work for meeting personal goals, doing things just because like it's the right thing to do, kind of these higher order values, maybe achievement goals because they just want the reward, right? So this is some of the things that people say and that you might, there is even research for some of these things. On the other hand, we know that if external rewards are put in place, they can be really effective in quickly changing behavior in the short term while the rewards are in place. So it's a strategy to get a quick behavior change if you need it, like jumpstarting kids into working on something. So it is a tool that we have in our toolbox, and the question is when and if we want to use it. So some of the recommendations associated with using external rewards are to try to keep in mind a balanced approach. So, for example, maybe only using rewards when you have a real issue on your hand. Something that's sort of a last resort strategy for when other things haven't worked. So, for example, you could put this into place in a time of crisis, right? So like if you have a middle schooler you're getting into April, May, and you're pretty sure that they're not going to pass the year and you want to get a little bit more work out of them, one of the things that you might be able to do is to put a contract in place saying, look, if you are able to get this homework done every day, we'll be working towards something at the end of the school year. But it's important to know that the literature does suggest that external rewards alone are not things that can sustain long-term motivation, right? So kids habituate to the rewards. They may not find them interesting anymore. And so it's not a long-term strategy. It's rather maybe a tool in your toolbox for the short term. So what are the recommendations about how to do it right? Well, first of all, ask yourself if you can do something else first. Here's kind of the checklist, right? So first, this is really just based on everything we just talked about. First, can I make it more enjoyable or engaging? Is there something about the way this, can I harness that intrinsic motivation, right, to get them done? This is like the project, right? Can we pick a topic on this project that they think is super cool that'll be way more easier for me to get them engaged? So that's one thing. Have I had that conversation, and are we having those conversations about personal reasons for wanting to succeed and work hard? That those come from the goals, that comes from the priorities, the things the kids care about, linking those things to hard work and succeeding. Are we having those kinds of conversations? Are kids developing that awareness over time? Is there something about the environment or the routine at home that I can change that could help with motivation? This is as simple as just saying, we've got to have a rule at home here that if you don't have your homework done, you can't go and play video games, right? That's what we're talking about. Or it might be, you know what, we're going to drop you off at the library right after school for 2 hours, and you're going to do work in that quiet place. Are those those little kind of environmental changes? Can we do some of those to get at the problem? Is my child having a problem with procrastination or pushing through the work in a way that is kind of part of the picture here? And then is there anything I could do to strengthen their cognitive skills to improve motivation? So those self-statements we mentioned, right? Teaching them how to kind of keep themselves on task, stay rooted to those reasons that they want to succeed. Can kids develop that? And some of that maybe you can do yourself as a parent or teacher, but also obviously there's cognitive therapies that are being done with kids with ADHD that are effective and can also potentially help in that way. Let's take a look at their lifestyle too. Are there things going on that might be kind of other factors here? So for example, is my child getting enough sleep? Are there significant stressors in their environment that are preventing them from doing their best? Are they keeping a healthy exercise and diet? So these are the types of things too that before we jump into the external rewards, we want to be looking at all these things, kind of a holistic approach to kind of helping the kid do their best. And of course, also is the kid experiencing a mental health problem that could be part of the picture here. If your child might be experiencing symptoms of depression, no amount of external rewards are going to solve the problem. You really need to help get treatment for that. So the other thing is, the first pass is usually to try to say, can we hone in on natural rewards that are already in their environment, already in their daily life, instead of creating kind of like big ticket new rewards, right? Like, so hey, can I say you'll get more video game time than normal if you do X, Y, and Z, instead of saying, hey, I'm going to buy you this, right? So those are kind of the next things that we want to look at. As part of this, though, to do it right, you have to also make sure that you only give student access to said reward if they have done what you've asked them to. So it doesn't work as well if video game, yeah, you get an extra hour of video game time if you if you get your homework done, but on the weekends you get to play it all day long anyways, regardless of anything. So then all of a sudden you don't crave it as much during the week when you're trying to use it as a reward. So you really want to think about the whole picture. Then here's a really important part too. The third thing is, if you're going to ask kids to do something that they don't want to do, and you're going to kind of go into a contract with them where they're now being kind of told, like, look, if you don't do this, X, Y, or Z is going to happen. It's really important that we maintain our perception as fair adults by actually talking to the kids about why. Why am I asking you to do this? What is the rationale for this task? Why do I feel like it's necessary? And and completely acknowledge that this is boring. You're not interested in doing it. Like, you don't see the value in it, and that's fair. And here's why I want you to do it anyways. And I want you to do it so much that I am willing to even offer you something that you want, because that's how much I want of it. And this is how adults work things out, right? When we don't agree with each other, we try to come to a compromise. We try to come to something that will get us both at least a piece of what we want so we can move forward. And that's also modeling for them how to be reasonable, how to have good communication skills, etc. And then also, to the extent that we can, we should give as much freedom of choice as possible on how the task is done. So if we're going to be implementing some semblance of control on someone where we're going to say, no, you kind of have to do this, at least let them do it however they want and don't micromanage the details, right? So I don't care where you do your homework, how you do your homework, but by 9 o'clock, I just want to see that it's done, that kind of thing. Okay, this is a dense slide, but since you're able to see it, I'll just go through some of the conclusions of this presentation with you real quick. So what are the take-home messages? Okay, building self-motivation, slow process. It's something you cultivate over time, over years. It's not something that you can quickly change in a child right now. So the efforts that you put in to do these small things every day, they may not pay off right away. Keep doing them anyways. There are small things we can do every day that contribute to the process. Try to do what you can. Every little thing you do is going to help in some way. We have to kind of come to terms that we can't really control what kids find intrinsically motivating. So we do have to harness their natural interests to route them into positive proactive activities within those interests that potentially show them the value of learning, show them the value of hard work, etc. In truth, there are ways you probably can influence whether a kid finds something intrinsically motivating based on how much exposure you give to different, activities and stuff. But I think it's easier to just think about it this way, that, we don't have full control over that, so we need to accept what they're interested in. We are in a position to help kids develop and enhance their awareness of their goals, their interests, to kind of understand their priorities based on conversations we can have with kids, based on activities that we can expose kids to. And these things all support the development of self-motivation. We have control over environments that kids are in, right? Both which environments they're in and what we do within the environments we've chosen for them. We can give kids experiences that support the development of things like self-control and willpower, so that they can better tolerate hard and boring tasks, right? Teaching them the value of hard work. We have to be careful not to undermine self-efficacy and how we interact with kids, even when we're super frustrated with them, which is really hard for us to do too. But we want to look to do those little things that help build self-efficacy, because that'll just make everyone feel better and everyone's life easier over time. We want to use an autonomy support approach when working with kids, letting them do things on their own, letting them choose how they do things. And even like if it makes us feel like it's not going to be done as well as if I help them, is the value of them doing it on their own, even if it's imperfect, bigger in the long run than having this assignment go perfectly tonight, right? And I don't know the answer to that question because it's different in different people's situations, but those are the questions that you can ask yourself as a parent or as a teacher. Those are the things that you guys can decide for yourselves. When we are faced with unrealistic goals that kids have, we're not going to like argue with them and try to persuade them they're wrong, because that's really hard to do, especially with teenagers. But we are going to try to build up other positive things that could be better alternatives for them, so that over time they may become more interested in those things. And finally, we do have external rewards as in our toolbox. And some of the recommendations, especially as kids get older, are to only use them when we really feel like we need to, right? Ask yourself, is the problem so big that I need to implement this contract or implement this behavioral system? Or is it something that I can tolerate, and try to address in less intrusive ways? So, again, all of this there are exceptions to all of these rules. All of you know the kids you work with best, and you'll know maybe the pieces of this that apply to certain kids more than other kids. And this is just to give all of you ideas and things to think about that you may want to apply to certain kids. Okay, so I think I've made this point too many times already. I even made a slide at the end because I care about this point so much. I put turtle. Remember that the turtle wins the race, the tortoise wins the race, and not the hare. So something to keep remembering. Some other things that I want to say at the end here, if you're doing everything right, if you're trying really hard and your child is still, not experiencing success, you have to ask yourself questions about the environment they're in and if it's a good fit for them. Are the expectations that are being placed on them fair for where they're at right now? Those are the kinds of questions that you have to start asking yourself next. If you are at your wit's end with trying everything you've seen, read, etc., and things still aren't getting better, I think the next step is often to go to a professional, like a therapist or a doctor, to see if there's other help that your child can get. Good therapy, for example, is really hard. It takes a lot of hard work from families and the kids, but it's totally worth it. So you have to kind of get yourself in the mindset that you're going to fully jump in and engage and do things at home and try new things and try things that are hard for you and try things that are stressful but potentially pay off in the end. And that's pretty much my talk. The last slide here has ways to get in touch with me. There's the book that was mentioned in the introduction that has even more information on the types of things that we talked about today is right here.